We have to make a decision as ordinary working people that we must organize for a political, economic, and social alternative.
It's actually Stalinism itself that has prevented so many people from drawing the same conclusions that Lenin drew.
The limits of this planet are the limits also of capitalism.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. We discuss pressing issues, highlight current events and active struggles, answer questions, and we bring the lessons of history to the present day. World to Win is hosted by the International Socialist Alternative, an organization made up of sections in more than 30 countries and existing on every continent. We don't just make this show. We're actively organizing in workplaces and communities every day. We're living in an era of one crisis tumbling right into the next, a deadly pandemic into a global depression.
This is a far, far more serious crisis for their system than that.
A global depression into potential climate chaos. Yet, at the same time, we're witnessing a momentous return of the labor movement, of workplace organizing, with more people getting up and getting involved every day.
Tens of thousands of people are going out to protest every week.
We need to rise to meet these new challenges. Tune in every Sunday to hear socialists from across the world talk about what's happening now and where to go next. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!
You're gonna count me down? Sorry about that, everyone. Let's try again. My name's Toya with the International Socialist Alternative, and welcome to World to Win. If everyone could take a moment to share this video, start a watch party. We know that this uprising that we're going to be talking about is taking the world by storm, and we want to make sure everyone is involved with this conversation. Let us know in the comment section if you've been to one of these Black Lives Matter protests that we're seeing across the world. How many people were there? What city were you in? And what chants and signs were people using at the protests? I want to get started, but first let's introduce our speakers. We have Algier, who's back with us again from New York City, who's a frontline worker. How's it going, Algier? Thanks. And new to the show is Ryan, a Socialist Alternative member in Chicago, who yesterday helped organize a protest of almost 40,000 people. Thanks for joining us today, Ryan. So let's get started. I don't want to waste any time. There's so much going on around the world. And last week we discussed a bit of the history of the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, we also touched on some ideas of a deeper understanding of the fight for Black liberation and the deep traditions of Marxism in that fight. I'm sure our viewers have seen how this current uprising, which is demanding justice for George Floyd, of course, has taken the world by storm. But today we will discuss how the movement has grown and what it needs. So Algier, why don't you kick us off? What stage are we seeing this movement in right now?
Well, we're entering the 10th day of protests, of organizing. Is taking place in urban settings and rural, small areas that will be deemed as conservative or even Trumpland areas of the country. It's in its tens and tens of thousands of people around the country. The reforms that were passed in 2014-16 has basically been thrown out the window. And now the movement is demanding not just the indictment, to which we've received the indictment of the 4 officers that killed George Floyd, but also the fight for the conviction of those 4 officers and more permanent reforms of the police, of the entire system as a whole. We've also seen the disarray of both political parties, Democrats and Republicans, and of course, the inability of Trump to really, I guess, lead the nation out of this particular crisis. And I would say last that this uprising has all the features of a multiracial explosion, mass explosion that ties in COVID-19, the economic depression, racial oppression, and in fact, it's rivaling all the large demonstrations we've seen over the past few years, including the women's rights movement protests after Trump was inaugurated.
Thank you so much, Algier. And I mean, to me, that's amazing. Some of those Trump protests were some of the biggest that I've ever been a part of. And now we're seeing larger protests than that. I want to go to Ryan, who was at a protest yesterday of, I think it was 38,000 people in Chicago. Ryan, would you say that the protests are working?
Yeah, you have to be straightforward and see that when it started off, we saw third-degree charges for only the one that was directly shown in the video of standing on George Floyd's neck. But since protests have been all across the country, of all character and kinds, we see that charges have been brought to all 4 police officers that were involved, as well as $1 million bails on the 3 who aided and abet, and then also we saw the upgrading of the charge that went to the main police officer that was on his neck, moving to 2nd-degree murder. So I would absolutely draw out that these protests are having an effect on the politics of the situation.
Thanks, Ryan. And I just want to shout out one comment that we have from Danny in England, who said that one of the chants included "the UK is not innocent," which I think is really interesting. It kind of ties in this idea that this isn't just a problem that we're seeing in the US, it's a problem that we're seeing everywhere. I want to go back to Algier. You know, Ryan was talking about how the protests are effective, but there's a lot of criticism from not only the mainstream media, but just, you know, regular working class people about the protests turning into riots. What do you say about that, Algier?
I think it's important for our movement to classify this not as a riot. That's the language of the corporate media. That's the language of those that want to deny that there are underlying issues that the system has produced that has made this moment real. So for us, I think it's important to call it a rebellion or uprising or a revolt, to which I think it is. And when King talks about this in the 1960s, he's talking about it within the context of Watts, 1965. He's talking about Newark in 1967. He says the riot is the voiceless, is the unseen, is the unheard. And so it is that within that context that we have to see that those events, if it wasn't for those events, it would have taken months to get the indictment of the 4 officers. It took them 48 hours to get the indictment of the officers, and then another few days for the other 3. And so this language of the looters and the thugs, certainly they are a minority within this particular historical moment. But let's really talk about the thugs. The thugs are the people, the Buffalo police, who knocked down that precious elderly man who was protesting for justice. The thugs are the Seattle Police Department that pepper sprayed a precious baby with her family protesting. Those are the thugs. It's the Jeff Bezos, it's the Exxon Mobil's, it's the billionaire class. Those are the thugs. And the way that we move our struggle forward is by highlighting the need of vital, coordinated, planned actions, using history as our marker from the standpoint of how the labor movement was built in the 1930s and 40s, and how the civil rights movement was built in the 1950s and 60s.
Thank you so much, Algier. And those videos are just disgusting. You know, you can, some of those videos you see of them pushing the elderly people down, you can hear, their heads hitting the ground, they're bleeding. It's just absolutely disgusting. But the police are trying to counter that with these sort of, stunts of doing things like taking a knee, and doing these photo ops. Ryan, what do you see? What do you think when you see those types of things? Does that mean that these police officers are joining the movement? What do you see when you see a cop taking a knee?
Yeah, I mean, to echo what Algier just said, we saw just 24 hours before they pushed that 75-year-old man who had the, all that gruesome elements, that they were taking, those same police officers were taking a knee in front of that exact same location. And so we can see like there's a contradiction there, is that there's an emphasis to try and sow, this ideal of bad seeds, and that these police officers are overwhelmingly, behind the smashing of racism. And there's also, a top-down effort that is trying to draw out that there's racism in America, but not necessarily systemic racism in the police force. But because of the nature of capitalism and the role of the police, you can't have a situation where, like in Seattle, which we have to point out that young girl who was sprayed by the police officers because there was no discernment of the quote unquote dichotomy of good and bad protesters from the police. That Jeff Bezos, who is on the route to being a trillionaire, coexists within the realm of a growing unemployment that exists within society at the same time. And so the police, honestly, the only thing that they have to maintain that level of status quo. And so, yeah, we see them kneeling sometimes for like photo shoots and things of that nature. But then like an hour or several hours later, or when the lights go down, they're taking their orders, and their orders are to keep order, to keep the order. And what does that order mean? The poor stay poor and the rich stay rich. And we're seeing that any type of uprising that challenges that must be quelled. And yeah, so the PR stunts are I think are not working, even though I think this has been a long-term thing that they've done.
Thanks so much, Ryan. And the symbolism of taking a knee against racism started many years back. We can look at someone like Colin Kaepernick, whose football career ended because of this, and now it's being kind of co-opted, as a way to show solidarity, when, as Ryan pointed out, in reality, it's a PR stunt. I want to remind our viewers that we're going to have a section of the show where we can ask our speakers questions, so be sure to put them in the comments. We do have one comment from Marcus in Brazil, who said, several protests in Brazil today against racist police killings taking place here, including the police storming a house, allegedly in pursuit of someone, firing 70 rounds and killing a 14-year-old kid, but also against the reactionary Bolsonaro government. And that, that message of storming a home and killing people, it's so familiar in the United States. Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her own home because of a no-knock warrant, which is something that should be illegal across the board. Her birthday would have been a few days ago. She would have turned 27. So solidarity to her family and stuff. So, it's the same type of system that we're seeing, whether it be in Brazil or the United States. But Marcus mentioned the Bolsonaro government. So I want to ask Algier, talk a little bit about the role of the Democratic Party in this movement, but then also Trump's reaction.
Well, I think it's very close to what Ryan was talking about the performative photo shots of cops kneeling down, while the next moment they're pepper spraying and shooting rubber bullets at people. What you have in many of the cities around the country, you have the Democratic Party who are in the leadership. They're in the leadership of city council, the mayoral office. And so what we're having a crisis of people like Mayor Duncan in Seattle, of de Blasio in New York, of Jacob Fry, who was ceremoniously, literally told to leave a protest just yesterday. And so these individuals, these Democratic Party leaders, mayors, city councils, they are trying to use the carrot and the stick, in fact. And so their crocodile tears are really going nowhere concretely. And Trump is portraying himself as the strong man. He has no confidence. And in fact, a lot of Republicans are really trying to distance themselves from him because he has shown no leadership from the standpoint of what the bourgeoisie, what the ruling elite wants him to do. He is certainly not the Obama type figure who, when the BLM movement rose in 2014, 2016, was able, despite he did nothing neither, but at least give some semblance of a confident leader to be able to talk to the nation at that historical moment. So when we think about this, they are not only unleashing the police, but in fact, they will be leading the austerity packages forthcoming that will attack key programs that affect the lives of working people, the poor, and the most oppressed of their cities.
Thank you so much, Algier. And last week we talked a lot about what Black people should do come November in regards to voting. So I encourage people to check out last week's episode to go a little bit more into the question of the Democratic Party. But the last question for this section before we move on, Algier, if you could talk a little bit about what demands we're seeing coming out of this movement. I know from my experience, it's a little bit different than what we saw during Black Lives Matter after the death of Michael Brown. So what are you seeing out on the streets right now?
Well, I think people are making the connection between police funding and the budget. For example, here in New York, the law enforcement budget is $5.6 billion, while at the same time, in order to deal with the shortfall or economic shortfall from COVID-19 and the lockdown, they're proposing cuts to education and healthcare. And so the movement, I think, in a very interesting way, is elevating the question of not just body cameras for police, as we saw in 2014 to 2016, but now they're talking about defunding the police. They're talking about getting the police unions out of the labor movement. That is also part of a big discussion and debate that's taking place. Even the idea of community control over public safety with democratically elected control boards that would have the power to fire, to hire, budgetary questions, shut down precincts, drive out the racists out of the police department. So I think these are the type of demands that are starting to be elevated on a very high level. And I think that's going to lead to even bigger battles. We have to keep in mind also that there will be many people who are not paying their rent. They're on rent strike. And the question of evictions will come. And who normally actually plays a role in executing a eviction in a forcible way? And that's law enforcement. So this question is not going to go away anytime soon, even with the George Floyd situation. Is because the role that they play in society and protecting the interests of the ruling elite. And so it's going to be very important that we develop our demands in a way that speaks to the everyday reality for working people, the poor, and the most oppressed.
Thanks so much, Algier. And I think it's really interesting to see the new demands, come out of the movement and develop. So before we move on, I want to talk a little bit more about the international section. I want to let people know that towards the end of our show, we have a special guest for our shout out of the week. So be sure to stay tuned. This man is a true working class hero. I can't wait to introduce him to you all. But let's shift a little bit and talk more about what we're seeing internationally. We've seen the spread of the movement and the huge turnouts all over the world, all the while happening during a pandemic and during lockdowns. And many people across the country are saying that they fear, dying at the hands of the police more than they fear of dying of COVID-19. And so that's why they're out during this time. Within a couple of days here in the US, there were thousands on the streets. And then that moved all over the world. And now it's a full-blown international movement with hundreds of thousands, potentially millions, if we're being honest, taking to the streets around the world over the past few days. Yesterday, we've seen in London, 50,000 people, 120,000 people in Germany. We have people in Australia, Dublin, Portugal, the list goes on. And it's important that the international protests not only are raising the question of justice for George Floyd, but they're also taking up the questions of structural racism under capitalism, and also in the context of the pandemic, which disproportionately has been killing communities of color. The International Socialist Alternative, we've played a key role in organizing and participating in demonstrations located in over 30 countries globally. We've initiated protests in some countries, and in some countries we've intervened with our Socialist program. So here's a quick video with a few clips of our members on protests in Ireland and the UK earlier this week.
My name is Miriam. I'm a member of the Socialist Party in Ireland, and I stand here in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. There's about maybe 1,000 people here standing in solidarity with Justice for George Floyd movement and with all the victims of racist abuse, of violence and murders. I stand here today because the world has sparked revolt around what the media keep trying to portray as an incident or as an accident rather than as a murderous act of systematic racism by the police. Racism was used to justify slavery, racism was used to justify Jim Crow in the south of the US, racism was used to justify apartheid in South Africa. Now racism, like all other forms of oppression, is still used in the interest of the capitalist elite to divide people and continue to strive for profit. This crisis showed that we run society, not the millionaires. We create the wealth, not the billionaires, and so we deserve to control it democratically so that inequalities and injustices and oppression can end once and for all.
I want to bring full solidarity of our trade union branch to this movement. Our branch today has put out a statement that says, like billions, hundreds of millions around the world, we've looked on with revulsion and anger at the brutal racist murder of George Floyd. We think that murder is another damning indictment of a deeply racist, oppressive and exploitative capitalist economic system. The US and UK have a shared history of racism and police brutality. Minneapolis has a proud trade union history. In the 1930s, militant trade unionists led a huge organising drive to fight for combative trade unions that saw brutal police actions against striking workers and their families. And I'm pleased to say that trade unionists in America have carried on that proud history today. Members of the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 1005, representing bus drivers, have refused to transport police officers to the demonstration in an act of incredible solidarity. Nurses, communication workers have also issued solidarity statements in support of the movement, and that needs to go further. We need not just solidarity statements, but mass, organised action by organised labour to fight back against racism and capitalism.
So now I want to go to Ryan to talk a little bit about the importance of these international protests. Ryan, what are you thinking, and what do you see when you see people across the world out protesting for something that's happening in the US?
I mean, I have to say, and this is probably true for anybody who is looking at this, is I'm very heartened by the situation that the rest of the world is probably seeing something that they've been wanting for quite some time, is to have the U.S. actually join the international struggle for working people on a scale that is seen, as Algier said, as a rebellion and a rejection of the politics of neoliberalism. But I mean, a part of that is we have to kind of draw out that there are definitely elements of racism that has been playing a role throughout, the far right movement that is kind of taking place. It's not just Trump. You have Bolsonaro in Brazil. You have Boris in the UK. You have Duterte, who was shooting people, under the guise that they were drug dealers in the Philippines. We're seeing a growing movement of far right and people taking more leftist politics. And right now we're trying to struggle for the heart of the working class to kind of get behind that we don't stand with these ideas. When Trump says coronavirus is the Chinese virus, like, the intent is to deflect from the racism that is very much top down, and the failures that the entire international ruling class has done in pushing forth an actual strategy against the spread of coronavirus, right? You can't take the George Floyd protest unless, of course, you're also drawing out that we were supposed to be living off 10 weeks of a $1,200 check, while also giving billions and trillions to big business. And the fact that Trump has denounced BLM and these type of actions, but just like a month or two ago was talking about that Nazis and other fascistic elements are probably good people, or the killing that we saw a couple of years back in, I think, Charlottesville, that there was problems on both sides, somewhat apologizing for the far right antics of running a car and killing a person. It has to be said that Trump is trying to embolden members of the far right, and this is not just a Trump antic. I mean, this is an international phenomenon, and it has to be drawn out that that's connected to capitalism and its role on an international scale of always whipping up xenophobic and racist ideologies to pit workers against workers, because the reality, our numbers are there, and if we had the solidarity that's necessary in this new movement to fight back, we would do much more like this video, like the name of the series, the world would be one. So
Thanks so much, Ryan. I totally agree with you. Solidarity is key, and we will get to that question of solidarity a bit later. But you were talking about Trump and all of these far right leaders. In the International Socialist Alternative here in the US, in Seattle, we have a city council member. She's not a Democrat, she's not a Republican, she's a socialist. And she's leading the way in showing what elected officials, not just in the US, elected officials around the world, what they can do to fight back against police brutality. Algier, will you tell us a little bit more about what Shama Sawant is doing in Seattle?
Sure. Well, first, also, Shama is not just an independent socialist and member of our organization, but also she's a union member, member of AFT 1789. And I think it's important to remember this as part of her historical record, that she was alongside Black Lives Matter activists in fighting against the construction of a new police police headquarters, in fact. And she was able, through the activism and organizing taking place, to block that police construction and divert those funds into affordable housing, which is absolutely crucial in Seattle, Washington. But what she's putting forward now in Seattle, I hope the viewers really look into this. Seattle is in a very dire situation politically right now. Mayor Durkin has basically allowed the Seattle Police Department to do whatever it wants to do, and basically has doubled down on basically protecting them. Mind you, the SPD is a police force that has a federal oversight over it, a consent decree, which they tried to eliminate just recently. And so Shama is putting forward, based on the most recent events, has put forward a couple key pieces of legislation that she's presenting to the city council. A ban on Seattle police to use and purchase of chemical weapons, rubber bullets, sonic or ultrasonic weapons, to ban chokeholds, a cut in police budgets by half to fund restorative justice. And that also can include more housing, education, jobs, key resources that the communities of Seattle need. And also the big one, which I think is absolutely vital, and that is tax Amazon and big business to fund housing, jobs, and a Green New Deal. Let's keep in mind, as Ryan correctly said it, Jeff Bezos is about to become the first trillionaire in human history. Amazon pays no taxes, on top of the fact that their workplaces is one of the most undemocratic places on the planet, the Amazon warehouses and places of work. So this particular piece of legislation is crucial to really give the movement even greater momentum, as we not only fight for not just a police accountability, but in fact change the whole concept around public safety, but also the resources that we need in our community to live a dignified life.
Thank you so much, Algier. And people can look more into what Shama Sawant is putting forward at socialistalternative.org. It's a really fascinating campaign to tax Amazon, and super important as a step towards racial justice by fighting against police brutality and the police budget in general. I want to shift the conversation just a bit because I have a question that I'm super curious about, Ryan, what your thoughts are. Do you think that if we weren't coming off of the back of this global pandemic, do you think that the protests would have the same nature? Like, is there any sort of correlation or connection with what's going on between the health crisis that we have and racial injustice and police brutality?
Absolutely. Like everything, it's like a domino effect. For one, they just released the numbers that if Black America would have had the same amount of deaths on the same scale as white America, there'd be 13,000 more people alive at this moment. And so one thing that has to be drawn out is that COVID-19 isn't racist. You know, it's not a racist virus that only attacks Black people, but that the system that's associated with it is capitalism is, in fact. So when we're talking about, food deserts and health disparities and the lack of jobs benefits or the essential workers who are often paid so very little, but we saw in this last period were either having to work and given like a month of $2 extra, even though, like Algier said, Amazon, the top 5 people, which includes Amazon, made $76 billion in the last 2 months. The richest people have garnered $400 billion in the last pandemic months. That you can't divorce the COVID-19 element that's fueling it. And the reality is, if the Democrats and the Republicans, even though I have no illusions in either one of them, if they actually wanted to fight for working people, if they wanted to solve these issues and we wouldn't have had this uprising, if they would have given what we see across the country, across the world, where $2,000 were given to each individual to kind of live, we definitely would not have seen the level of anger that's associated with this. But the reality is that this is the face of the system that we're struggling against. And so, yeah, you can't divorce the role of COVID-19 and the pandemic from the uprisings that are happening in the US.
Thanks so much, Ryan. I totally agree with you. I mean, it's for some places in the world, wearing masks to a protest might be normal, but I know here in the U.S. It wasn't, and it was really powerful to see how serious people are taking it. Handing out hand sanitizer, wipes, masks, just so that we could safely be out on the streets and try to build a movement to affect change. We're going to have this. We are beginning to have this economic recession, depression coming our way. And so we have a huge need for a united working class fight back. As Malcolm X said, and we say this all the time, but it's so, so true. He said, you can't have capitalism without racism. We hear this and we see it all over the place, but capitalism needs all of these isms to divide us. It needs sexism, racism, nationalism. And so that's why we need to build a united global movement of the working class. The International Socialist Alternative is working tirelessly to help build this movement. And if you agree with the analysis that you've heard here today, you want to be involved, you're feeling inspired, please, please consider joining the International Socialist Alternative in your country. So now let's move to some of our questions and comments from our viewers. I'm going to start with Ryan. We had a question from Amelia who was asking about how the protests get planned and the community organizations that are involved. I know you personally were involved in helping to build that hugely successful rally that happened yesterday in Chicago. Can you let our viewers know how these protests are happening?
Yeah, for sure. So there's the energies to get behind these protests are already there. People are already interested in having and being a part of them, but you have to be drawing out the demands that are associated with such marches, because you want to be drawing out that there's a reason for people to be there, that they're not just there. Absolutely being there in solidarity is one part, but actually drawing out conclusions of like, these are the things that we're standing for. The conviction of these 4 police officers, for example. And then also like you have to maintain a level of safety because the goal is not to bring an activist layer out. The activists are already aware of these problems. They're already struggling. We want to bring out the working people that have only been touched by this notion of George Floyd, and showing them that, your particular city has a particular history of police violence, so that's directly a part of it. So you have to have the culture of safety and allowance that somebody can bring their children to that. And I would say, although there have been rallies throughout the days and on work days, and I think like we should use powerful actions of like a strike during a Monday through Friday type of period, but like actions on the weekends will definitely attract larger amounts of people to come out because the harshness of this system, because having to choose between going to work to feed your children and fighting for an issue that you feel strongly for in a system that is unforgiving is a very hard tactic. But we should be building for that level of necessity. If by connecting these demands to much larger demands, like, yes, we want to convict these 4 police officers, but we also want to improve the schools in neighborhoods that have been historically underfunded, which often overlap with communities of color, particularly Black communities in Chicago on the West and South Side. So those things have to play a role in it. And then also, when people are there, I would argue politics that draw them into it and like allowing them to own elements of it, is definitely a part of it. Not politics of shaming, I would say, but like politics of solidarity should be the guiding principle moving forward. And then laying out goals, not to say like, I'll stop at this point, but you actually have a foundation that says, we've we've been successful here, because that will allow for an energy to actually be able to be like, look, we should go further and look at what we've already done. So I think those are the sheer elements. Obviously, there's logistics that come into play. Working out pathways. We walked yesterday from Union Park as a start to Cabrini Green, which has a history of racist policies, police violence, and now it has went from a public housing location to now a very expensive gentrified location, where it's now cost $3,700 a month to live in an area that Section 8 housing was $8 or something like that. So like those roots are super important. But yeah, those are I think I would argue are the main basis of like structuring that.
Thanks so much, Ryan. It's really important that we share, success stories of how to plan and how to have, an effective rally and a protest. I want to go to Algier. This is changing the topic a little bit, but I think our viewers are going to be interested to hear what you have to say. Peter from the Netherlands asked, do Biden, who is the Democratic nominee, sorry, my dog gets a little upset when I say that name. Do Biden or the DNC think that they have an easy race now, swinging these protests behind them? What do you say to that, Algier?
I think on one level, they do, but I think they're going to have a very difficult time considering the fact that Biden's record on this question, if you disassociate him from the Obama years, I mean, he was the prince of neoliberalism. He carried out and was the author of the crime bill, 1997, mass incarceration. And so his legacy of even defending the segregationists inside the Democratic Party when he was a junior senator in the Congress. And so his record speaks louder than words. But frankly, the Democratic Party will attempt to ride this protest moment in a serious way. He does have a lead on Trump as we speak. Biden, will be going to speak with the Floyd family on Monday, tomorrow, and the prospects of him going to the funeral down in Houston, Texas, is also a strong possibility. There are many people within the movement that are now saying we have to go out and vote in November. Even members of the Floyd family is saying people need to go out and vote. And I think it's creating a false dichotomy on the question of voting and social protests. Because frankly, the social protests won the indictments of the 4 officers. And if we were to just leave it in the hands of the politicians, let's keep in mind that under the Obama years of 8 years, there was a 3% indictment rate of killer cops. He was unable, his administration and his Justice Department was unable to get justice for the Garner family. He was unable to get justice for a whole slew of families that were dealing with the question of police violence. So yes, Biden may win in November, but we believe that he will not have a honeymoon period. The expectations will be high, and I think the ferocity, keep in mind, he'll be coming into a crisis of law enforcement terror on one side, of still the COVID-19 pandemic, and the economic depression that he will have to answer for and deal with. So he may win, but he'll have a rocky road ahead.
Thank you so much, Algier. We have time for one last question, and it's from one of my favorite viewers who always asks great questions. Their name is Yara from London, and they asked, and we'll point this question to Algier. They asked, a lot of people on the left have historically said that white people shouldn't be involved in the same way in the struggles of people of color. But during the recent protests, we've seen a really diverse crowd with white people advocating massively for minority rights. Should we exclude white people from the struggle? What do you say to that question, Algier?
Absolutely not. The fear of God has been brought to the ruling elite. When you have a multiracial, working class, young people out into the street. In fact, if you look at some of the protests, and even in, I believe it was in England, where they tore down a historical figure, his monument, they tore it down. I saw nothing but white people there that tore it down. So it speaks to the interest, actually, of ordinary working people and ordinary working class white youth that believe in justice. Let's keep in mind that when our movement is at its best, it has always been multiracial. If we look at the development of the labor movement and the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the role of socialists, of organizing in the workplace among Black and white workers. We think of the civil rights movement, the early phase of the civil rights movement, with Black and white civil rights workers with the freedom rides of 1961. And of course, the place where Ryan is born and raised, Chicago, and the great chairman, Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party, who advocated a radical rainbow coalition of trying to unite Black, white, Latino youth into a mighty political force in Chicago. And so we don't need allies in our movement. We need people who are active participants that's standing on the question of solidarity and action and revolution. That's what we need. So white youth, those who believe in justice and freedom, we want to lock arms together and march down that road to freedom in a socialist world.
Thank you so much, Algier, and thank you both for participating in our show today. Now we have our special guest for our shout out of the week. And I know Pat from Ireland is going to be really excited because his question was directed and perfect for our guest today. We have Ryan Timlin, who's the president of ATU, which is the bus drivers union in Minneapolis, 1005. I'm a member of Socialist Alternative in Minneapolis. Our shout out of the week goes to the Minneapolis branch of Socialist Alternative. Ryan, thanks so much for coming on the show. Tell us what's happening in your union right now and about this petition I've been hearing so much about.
Yeah, sorry, one quick thing, it's the Transit Workers Union. We represent all the frontline transit employees at Metro Transit. Sorry, our maintenance members don't get enough recognition too, so I just want to clarify that. What's the petition? It actually was great. So just some brief background. I got a call from a member who actually is a member of Socialist Alternative, Adam Birch, who is what would be called an extra board driver. So they fill in for bus drivers who call in sick, or they do a quick fill in for a route if a bus broke down. He was concerned that he might have to drive a police bus because of his position, where he'd be a call driver, because historically that's what's happened in the Twin Cities, is the buses have been used for emergency situations. So like in the winter, if there's a fire, they bring out a bus so that there's a warm place for people to stay, but they've also been used for protests. So when he called me, I suggested to him he should write a petition and direct it towards the governor of Minnesota, because he's the one that will be making that call and that request. And what I told him and I do on our end in the office is we would try to set up where it was only volunteers who would operate the bus. And there was a volunteer list we had. It's just the reality. We know some of our members are going to do that. So it just seemed like a simple, easy way to do it. Management never got back to us about the volunteer list. And then what they ended up doing was shutting down service, except for bringing in the lowest seniority members and forcing them to drive the bus. And if they refused, they would cut their pay. So we would have to go around. There's a class action grievance that has been filed this week to defend all members who lost pay in that situation. But we'd have to call and let them know what was going on. You have the right to refuse, and this is what you need to do, X, Y, and Z to refuse work. And we will include you in the class action grievance and fight for any lost pay, because what they're doing is since they shut down, the majority of the workers at home, they're getting paid. But then these lowest seniority operators are being forced into a situation, one, that they supported the majority of the protests, and they also wanted justice for the Floyd family. And also became safety issues and a whole ball of different things. But the main thing on the ground is they supported the protests, and they wanted justice for Floyd. So that is how that got started, and it forced them to come out and say that it forced Metro Transit actually to not allow any buses to be used for arrest. But what it did do is they still used them to transport state troopers, not police, but state troopers to different areas. But our members still had that right to refuse.
That is super inspiring, and it shows how union members can really help out the protests and involve themselves in social movements. Ryan, can you talk a little bit about the effect that these Minneapolis transit workers, not just bus drivers, sorry about that, can you talk about the effect that it's had nationally?
It's been actually internationally. We've been getting messages from England, from across the globe, of support. Just because this video, this is one of the first videos that has been out there where it's so clear that this was wrong. So it's been inspiring. We've gotten messages from all over the globe and locally, but locally, just to give an example, we went out to the protests. A number of our members went out to the protests and handed out water one of the days. And when we said we were the transit workers union, we got so many thanks for it. But if you bring up Metro Transit itself, they're not seen so well because they have allowed the transporting of the police to happen. But the fact of our members refusing has been inspiring, and it's just amazing what we've been hearing, how many things we've been hearing about it. So that's about all I can say. It's just been, I was blown away by the support we've received.
It's so inspiring. I mean, I've heard even in New York City now, the TWU and the bus drivers there are refusing to take protesters. Here in Boston, it wasn't done through the union rank and file, but the bus drivers are no longer transporting the police to the protests. And you know, the effect that it's having on union members is growing. I myself am joining finally a union contingent for the protest that we're having today after being inspired what you did in Minneapolis. We're seeing that members of Socialist Alternative in Minneapolis also organized grocery walkouts of frontline workers for 8 minutes and 46 seconds because that's how long the officer's knee was on George Floyd's neck. So I guess the last question that I have for you, Ryan, is what do you say to union members that want to show their support? What can other union members do across the globe?
I think they should write messages, resolutions to try to get their unions to go out into the communities and support the communities. That is the biggest thing right now is you got to draw that connection. And that was one of the quick connections that was drawn in our local our members. It's a very diverse workforce. We have Somali members, we have Black members, we have Hmong members, and it goes beyond that. There's more than that. They're exposed to racism every day. And like me, I live in the 3rd precinct where this happened at. A lot of our members live in these neighborhoods, and you have to draw that connection that we need to link up with the community. And this needs to go further as the discussions have been said before. We need a movement to make sure this happens. This doesn't happen anywhere. It's not just Minneapolis, it's across the globe. We do not need any more George Floyds. I remember one of the things that radicalized me when I was younger was Amadou Diallo, and no justice was done around Amadou Diallo. So that's why this needs to be pushed. But also it's been inspiring to see since this, the unions locally have been speaking out more. The Postal Workers Union president, I was with her at a press conference today talking about doing more with the movement and actually in the community. But also it's been inspiring to see finally the Minnesota state AFL-CIO has asked for the racist head of the police union to step down. These things need to happen in the labor movement for it to progress and move forward. Otherwise, all the statements that have been made before, linking these things together, it's all true. It has to. We have to play a role. We are the working class. We are the ones that may produce the wealth in society. Now, granted, we may be public sector workers. The argument may say, what do you produce? Well, we provide the transportation for the rest of the working class to go to factories or wherever that they're producing the wealth. And we need a massive transformation in society. And there's a role the unions can play in that. They've played it historically, like the formation of the CIO here, as Algier alluded to earlier in the US.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, Ryan. And thank you all for joining the show today. Be sure to tune in next week. Make sure you like and subscribe to our channel. We'll be here for episode 4. next Sunday, same time, same place. Thanks.